All right. Well, it is good to be with you guys in worship this morning. Feel free to pull your sermon outline out as we go through this time together, continuing our series in the Beatitudes. And I thought, since we were talking about the pure in heart, I would start with some confession in my sermon today. So I have something to confess to you guys. I'm not proud of this, but I thought it'd be important that we talk about it. I used to watch the show The Bachelor. Okay, I got it off my chest. I thought about doing the pastor thing where I say I was flipping through channels and came across The Bachelor, but the truth is, before kids, back when we could watch TV that wasn't Paw Patrol, I would watch The Bachelor sometimes. And if you've never seen the show, you're more pure in heart than me, but the show The Bachelor is a false premise where they pretend as if two people are going to fall in love and get married, but really they're just all going to start their own Instagram accounts. That's kind of the premise of the show. And over you hear this phrase if you watch The Bachelor, I don't know if he's here for the right reasons. Are you here for the right reasons? I don't think she's here for the right reasons. The truth is, none of them are there for the right reasons, unless the right reason is promoting their vegan beef jerky brand, which is called Mistake, by the way. I was just really proud of that dad joke. And the background of this concept of the right reasons really permeates the whole concept of why would someone want to fall in love on a dating show? And it's so absurd that, of course, we can kind of laugh at it. But this phrase, the right reasons, I think is in the background of a lot of our decision making. It may not be on a TV show, but when you're dating, you're wanting to find out, does this person really love me, the real me? Do they want to marry me or be in a relationship with me? And maybe not just while we're dating, but the rest of our lives, for the right reasons. Are my friends for the right reasons? Or is it something they're trying to get out of me, or because they feel guilty, or they feel embarrassed by me? What are the right reasons why they're my friend? Is this person in my life maybe running for office, a politician doing it for the right reasons, or their own personal gain? Maybe spiritual leaders, pastors in your life, are they doing this for the right reasons? I want to encourage that question, the right reasons, because I think it speaks to a God-given longing in us to say, what's going on in someone's heart deeply matters. Their motivation matters, not just their actions. Now, cynically, we could say, well, as long as they're doing the right thing, what does it matter what their reasons are? But you and I know people's reasons matter. If your spouse said to you, I don't love you, I've never loved you, but I've done all the right things and I will continue to do all the right things all our life, man, what a blow that would be. That is one of the worst things you could ever hear. This longing tells us something not just about romance or friendship or political office, but also something about our relationship with God. Goodness, don't you think that God, in the same way, would want to have us be in a relationship with him for the right reasons? That's what we're going to talk about today when we talk about the Beatitude. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are those whose hearts, not just their actions, are integrated in their relationship with God, that they're pursuing God for the right reasons. We're going to look at this Beatitude in sort of two parts today, what it means for us to be pure in heart, and then secondly, why this opens up this deep hope, incredible hope of seeing God. Well, if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, where the Beatitudes come from, this part from the Gospel of Matthew 5-7, you know that Jesus is really prioritizing your heart over just your actions. So he tells his disciples over and over again, you have heard it said, and he talks about an action, like do not murder or do not commit adultery or do not steal. But then he says, but I say to you, and then he talks about the heart behind it, right? The one who has looked lustfully on his neighbor's wife has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The one who hates his brother has already murdered him in his heart. Jesus deeply cares not just about our actions, he does care about our actions too, but the heart behind them. Similarly, Jesus warns deeply against following religious leaders or emulating the example of religious leaders whose actions are right, but their hearts are far from God. You heard the reading that Pastor Tim read a few minutes ago from Matthew 23. Woe to you Pharisees, right? You only care about what people see, but you don't clean the inside of the heart. Purity of the heart is deeply important to Jesus. And to understand why, we need to talk a little bit about what the heart means in the Bible. Now, in our culture, in our day, as Americans in the 21st century, we think of the heart as our feelings and our emotions. We sort of resign our decision-making to the will, our intellect to the mind, and we just think of following our heart as kind of what Freud talked about as the id, just our desires, our emotions, the things that we want to do. And then we give each other the foolish advice to follow our heart, as if we should just do the things that we want to do rather than the things that make sense or the things that have any sort of moral value to them. Well, in the Bible, the heart is a much broader concept. In the Bible, the heart isn't just the thing that we feel, but it's also our decision-making. It's also our thoughts. It's also all those things, sort of the prime seat of the human person is the heart. When the Bible talks about being pure in heart, it's really talking about the inner life of us having an integration and an integrity that is congruent, where our emotions, our thoughts, and our decision-making all line up in a straight line. As Proverbs 4:23 describes why the heart is so important, it warns us to protect the heart. It says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." Purity of heart means someone who has kept their life and who has continually turned their life in the direction that leads to life. It describes a person who's orienting their life around God with a single devotion towards Him. And this phrase, the pure in heart that Jesus uses, is actually not his original phrase. It comes from the Old Testament, from Psalm 24, which we'll talk about later, and Tim read a few minutes ago. It refers to the person who has a single aim, a single direction. The word from Psalm 24 is a Hebrew term that comes from metallurgy. It means metal that has no contaminants in it, that has had everything burned off and is just gold or just silver. It's where impurities are pushed away and where there is a single-mindedness, a single devotion. I got to be honest, this is the part of the sermon that I've struggled the most with this week, because I've been trying to figure out how to make pure in heart sound as compelling as I believe it is, and running the risk of it sounding really boring. Because I think sometimes our culture really lionizes Renaissance men and Renaissance women, people who have a wide range of interests, people who are surprising to us because they're so curious about the world. Ever since Da Vinci, we've kind of been obsessed with people who are like, I'm not just a doctor, I'm also a physicist, and I play the viola, and I'm a skydiver. And we say, oh, how interesting. You're such an interesting person. And we sort of transpose that to the spiritual life. And we think that people who have a broad range of interests must be more interesting than sort of simpletons who only think about or are only devoted to one thing. And I thought, how do I communicate the idea that the pure in heart, of which Jesus is the perfect example, is not the most boring person, but actually a very interesting and compelling way to live? And I guess one way to start that is to say, well, if you are living for one thing, that one thing better be pretty compelling. Right? If you are living for one thing and that one thing is archery, that might be a pretty boring life. Right? If you're living for just one thing, this is all your life is ordered around, and it's watching The Bachelor, it's a pretty boring life, right? You probably should diversify, because that is boring and that will fail you. Right? And so I just hope by naming that we can get across the idea that to live for God alone is not any more boring than God is boring. Purity of heart itself helps us avoid the boredom of being pulled in so many different directions that our interests are diffused and we're distracted and dull. Clarence Jordan, who started an organization that would eventually become Habitat for Humanity, a Greek scholar from the first half of the 20th century, and himself a very interesting and single-minded man, wrote it this way. He said, "Now when people attempt to live a double life spiritually, that is, to appear on the outside pure, but are not pure in heart, they are anything but blessed. Their conflicting loyalties make them wretched, confused, and tense." I love that description. Their conflicting loyalties make them wretched, confused, and tense. Man, that's been my experience. When I've divided loyalties, I become anxious and tense and anything but compelling. And having to keep their eyes on two masters at once makes them cross-eyed, and their vision is so blurred that neither image is clear. We've all probably watched movies of, the double agent, the spy who has a secret life, and we think, oh, that seems so exciting and so interesting. But if you've actually ever known someone living a double life, their life is anything but compelling. It's this blurry, cross-eyed attempt to try to keep two realities running at once, hoping the other one will not find out. They don't end up being this compelling figure you want to be like, but this pitiable figure who has tried to live beyond reality. How boring a double life actually is. In a couple weeks, we're going to get to enjoy the Olympics, watching the Olympics. And I don't know if you enjoy the Olympics. I enjoy the Olympics. And I didn't mean to take any shots at archers. If any of you are active archery people, I hope you enjoy watching the archery. Actually, there's a pastor's kid from our denomination who's going to be in the Olympics, so I'm excited to watch him shoot his arrows, right? That's what you'd say, shoot their arrows. All right, anyway, but I think the Olympians give us an example of what single-mindedness can look like in our spiritual life. Because every decision that these young men and women have made over the last number of years have been in the frame of their goal of making the Olympics. If someone tries to make the Olympics and they also try to do 5 other things, guess what? They don't make the Olympics, right? They have to sort of shape all their choices, all their priorities in light of this overarching goal and aim. And unfortunately for them, that goal and aim will be fleeting. In 2 weeks, it'll be over. It'll be gone. Whether they win or not, whether they receive a medal or not, it'll be gone. Oh, by the way, as long as we're talking about the Olympics, let's all cheer for the women's water polo team because a young woman in our church, Rachel Fatala, is going to be competing for them. So watch out for Rachel in the Olympics and cheer her on. And after she comes back, after the Olympics are over and you see her at church, don't say, Pastor Bob said that was fleeting. Right? Don't. Rachel, if you're watching, we're cheering for you. Olympic athletes give us this example of single-mindedness that really should give us a small picture of what it means to be singly minded, devoted to God. As Kierkegaard described it, to be pure in heart is to will one thing, to have one aim, one goal, one direction that we are shooting for. In the book of James, it talks about the opposite of this is to be a double-minded man, unstable in all we are, pulled back and forth in 2 different directions. What life would you rather have, right? To be the sort of person with the integrity and the goal and the aim and the ambition to pursue one great thing, or the double-minded man or woman who gets tossed back and forth aimlessly, never really pursuing anything. That's what the Pharisees sort of represented, right? The person who were the people who were not pure in heart, but rather whose lives represented hypocrisy, who pretended like they were trying to pursue God, but instead were really pursuing the praise of people. In Matthew 23, in the passage Tim read a little bit ago, it describes the woes. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and plate, that the outside may be clean." The opposite of being pure in heart really is this concept of hypocrisy, where all we really worry about is that people would see us as good, whether our hearts were turned towards God or not. I wonder today, sort of like as you hear this beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, I imagine for some people, the hypocrisy that you're aware of in your life is just sort of screaming at you to the point that it's hard to even think about it. Because you know the double-mindedness that's there. There's maybe some part of your life or aspect of your life that's so clearly double-minded that it's hard for you to even think about it or wrestle with it because it's become such a core part of your identity. If this is you, if you see yourself in the mirror of God's word really clearly, man, what better day than the 4th of July to live out freedom, right? To live out what Galatians 5 talks about, that we are called to freedom, not as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love to serve one another. Christ has set you free from the bondage of sin and death. You don't have to walk in that. You don't have to live a double-minded life. Christ has made it possible for you to be pure in heart. And the preciousness of that, the goal of that, the dream of being pure in heart, to see God is worth any costs that you could endure to get there. If you need help trying to push off the double-mindedness, I'm happy to talk to you after the service. There may be deep costs to revealing that hypocrisy, but it's worth it to be able to see God. I imagine some others of us are listening to this, and it's a little more dull in the background of where the hypocrisy lies in our life. We're not, we don't have 3 different families in 3 different states. We're not actively like a rogue agent for the Soviet Union or whatever. And so the hypocrisy isn't on the surface for us, but it's still there. And it's sort of more of a dull ache, of realizing that we're trying to pursue the praise of 8 different places at the same time. We're trying to pursue God's praise and people's praise, and we have our political loyalties and our familial loyalties and our professional loyalties, and we feel like the person who's trying to juggle 8 plates at once, rather than the Olympian who's straining after one goal, to see God and to know God. I'm aware of the challenges of hypocrisy and how quickly and how insidious they can be because the praise of people is so intoxicating, especially in a church. When I talk about purity or being pure in heart, for my generation, what comes up a lot is the purity culture of the 1990s and early 2000s. If you guys weren't in youth group culture in the 90s and 2000s, or you didn't have kids in that, what this was a lot of conferences and books that were built around the idea of encouraging sexual abstinence until marriage for high schoolers and young adults. And goodness, anyone who is willing to go talk to teenagers about sex has my sympathies as like a vocation. So I'm not trying to take shots on youth pastors from the 90s. I had a wonderful youth pastor in the 90s, and I'm grateful for him. But I think there were probably some unhelpful ways that we talked about purity in that generation that have sort of seeped into our concepts of hypocrisy today. You see, in the purity culture movement and the true love waits movement, what you were encouraged to do as a parent or maybe as a youth group was to tell people that their purity was something that they received and they had until they had sex out of marriage, and then they lost it, and then their purity was gone. And so we'd give young children or teenagers would be given purity rings, told to hold on to their purity until their wedding night. The problem with that is it communicated the idea that purity was something external based on our actions, rather than something internal based on our heart. And it was something that we had until we lost it, which honestly isn't the way that Jesus talks about purity at all. Purity is something that comes from the heart, according to Jesus, not something that comes from outward actions. And it's not something that we have until we lose it. Rather, it's something that we pursue in the power of the Spirit, and something that we are given based on Christ's death on the cross. Jesus' view of purity is that purity of the heart is at least important, if not more so, than purity of the body. As Proverbs 20, verse 9 says, "Who can say, I have made my heart pure? I am clean from my sin." Gosh, in hindsight, if I had been given a purity ring in 7th grade, 3rd grade, 10th grade, whatever, the truth is I didn't deserve it, right? There was no purity in my heart or in your heart apart from Christ. And if you've become a Christian and he's cleansed you from sin, there's no external action that's going to invalidate that or cause that to be lost. How can we hope to have a pure heart? It's not by doing the right thing on the outside, whatever the outside is, whether it's sexually or otherwise. The only hope for a pure heart is to turn completely to Jesus, that he may reign in us alone, as Bonhoeffer said. All right. I have an odd amount of notes for this sermon, and I'm trying to figure out how much time we have left. We have some time. That's always what Regina says. I appreciate the encouragement, Regina. All right. So, why would you and I try to pursue a pure heart if it is so illusory and so outside of our sinful nature? Well, because it's something that Christ empowers us to be able to do. As 1 John 3:20 says, whenever our hearts condemn us, and that's been a lot of our experience, God is greater than our heart. Whenever our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our heart. And down in verse 23, he says, this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. Purity doesn't come from our actions. Being a pure-hearted person doesn't come from our own moral fiber or own moral character, but from the gift of Jesus Christ, that he has, as Chris said earlier in the service, lived the life we are called to live. He has lived a fully pure-hearted life, and yet he died the death we deserve. And in his death and resurrection, we have a purity of heart gifted to us by his righteousness. And as we believe in it, as we believe in him, he cleans the fissures of our heart, empowering us to believe in him and to love one another. In light of that, as Hebrews 12 says, that we make every effort to live in peace at all times and be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. There's a desire to, maybe a natural desire, when we hear about the pure-heartedness that Christ wants for us, to say, well, I could never do that. I could never reach that. That's beyond my capacity. That's maybe for some monk in Egypt or something, but that's not for me. Well, all of us can make an effort in that direction, though. All of us can move towards being pure in heart from where we are. If purity of heart is not something that we can quickly lose, like a ring, but rather a direction of life, a direction of the soul, we can all move in the direction of being pure-hearted this week. And we can take the exhortation from Hebrews seriously to make every effort in that direction. Make every effort to be holy, to make every effort to be pure-hearted. Because without that, none of us can see God. Well, and this is really where I want to spend the last part of the sermon, because I think it is almost an intoxicating promise, an amazing promise that Jesus offers. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The idea that we would see God himself is the hope of the Christian life. It's the hope of why Jesus came. As the prologue to the Gospel of John says, no one has ever seen God, but the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. The reason Jesus came ultimately is so that you and I would see God. We tend to think of that in terms of our own salvation from sin, and we think of that as our own protection. But really the goal of that protection, the goal of that is to see God himself. But the only way to see God is through being pure in heart. If you've read the Old Testament, you know that there are all these barriers to seeing God in the Old Testament law. That's why there's a continual expectation of holiness for the priests and special expectations of holiness for the high priest when they go in the Holy of Holies. Even though they would not see God in that time, to be close to God requires an extraordinary, inhuman amount of holiness, beyond what we can expect or create on our own. To actually see God, not just enter the Holy of Holies, requires the amount, a pure hardness beyond what we can create. For Jesus to say, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, he's promising something the Old Testament law itself could not provide. I got to be honest, as I thought about this, I kind of thought more about the negative. I thought about blessed are the pure heart, for they shall see God. And then I kind of created my own woe in the background that's not in the Bible. Watch out for the unpure-hearted, for they shall not see God. Maybe that's me being glass half empty or whatever. But I really want to focus on the positive, right? That you and I have a hope of one day seeing God. When I hear people talk about heaven, when I talk about heaven, I often think about the things that I've experienced and my longing to experience them again, to see certain people I've missed, to have certain experiences that would be wonderful, to experience the lack of pain and loss. But those are all secondary to the great hope of heaven, which is to see God himself face to face. Of course, in this life, our uncleanness makes that impossible. Right? That's what we see in the Old Testament law. That's what we see in Isaiah when he says, woe to me, for I am a person of unclean lips, from a people of unclean lips. To see God and to be in his presence in sin without a pure heart is a death sentence. As Psalm 24 says, who can come before God, right? Only the one with a pure heart and clean hands. And yet we are still to seek him. As verse 6 says, such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. That's the great hope of this beatitude, that you and I could see and seek God's face, not by the pure-heartedness we create, but by the pure-heartedness that Christ gives us and that we live into. You and I can expect to see the face of God. As 1 Corinthians 13 talks about in the great love chapter, it says, now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now we know in part, then we shall know fully, even as we have been fully known. Well, last thing before we close. I've tried to, throughout these Beatitudes, talk about them on three different levels. On one sense, they're to describe life today. Right? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I think that's true. I think that when our minds are directed towards God, we're more likely to see God at work in this world. I think you can experience that this week, not just in heaven in the future, but this week. The extent to which our minds are singularly devoted to God makes it more and more likely for us to recognize God's work in the world. The second thing I hope you notice in every beatitude is that it's a hope of heaven. It's a hope of heaven. And this beatitude certainly is that. Right? Blessed are the pure in heart, those whose sins are forgiven and whose mind is directed to Christ, for they shall see God. That's the heavenly hope that this beatitude offers. And then the third thing I've tried to communicate about every beatitude is that it describes Jesus for us. And this beatitude describes Jesus. He is the one who is perfectly pure in heart, who wills one good thing, who lives an ideal life, not just of its lack of sin, but also its pursuing of God himself. And in that purity of heart, he has seen God and he has shown us God. Jesus is the archetype of this beatitude and the one that we follow and that we learn from. So, how is your purity of heart? How much are you pursuing one good thing in God himself? Versus how much has your life become divided and maybe subdivided and subdivided? A soul that is broken in so many parts that it's not really pursuing anything anymore. Christ has offered you freedom from the slavery of sin. He offers you the hope of a pure heart and an opportunity to pursue him. I hope this week you'll get some time with God and say, God, how pure is my heart? How much am I longing to pursue you? And secondly, how would the hope of a vision of God himself help burn away the impurities and distractions of this world? Let's pray together. God, I look at my life and my heart and I see how much is not focused on one good thing. And God, I confess that I long to be the sort of person that Jesus was, that is not boring in his single-mindedness, but is compelling in his devotion to you. God, I pray for my brothers and sisters here. They have so many expectations on them, expectations that are good in some ways at times. Expectations to be fathers and grandmothers and employees and neighbors and citizens and a whole host of other expectations on their life. And God, I know how difficult it is to hold those things without becoming a divided person or a split person or a hypocritical person. God, I pray that you would give them every effort, every ounce of energy this week to pursue the one good thing of knowing you. That they would seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness above all. God, I pray for our church. May we be known as a people, as a group, as a community that is so focused on you that we are not divided, that we're not hypocrites, that we're not moving in a bunch of different directions, but that we are moving towards you together. In Christ's name we pray.